I miss my mom so much. I wish I could take it all back, talk to her, hug her, tell her I love her, and I wish she loved me and was happy herself. These are the words of a man who, together with his brother, murdered both his parents, his mother, and his father. Doesn't really fit with such sentimentality, does it? Or maybe it makes sense. This episode is about the Menendez brothers, Lyle and Eric. They went on trial in the early 1990s in Los Angeles, at a time when stores were being looted and street gangs were at war. But the Menendez story eclipsed everything else. Mansions, Porsches, Rolexes, family drama, domestic abuse, courtroom breakdowns, and horrific details of violence that felt ripped straight out of a Tarantino film. To get inside the courtroom and see the killers, people would line up outside at 4 a.m. Some cursed the brothers, calling them greedy and manipulative sadists. Others sympathized, asking for lighter sentences, or even for their release. And over time, the number of supporters only grew. The Menendez case is still relevant today. Books are written, TV shows are made, and even after 30 years, people still argue about the details of this sensational trial. Today, we'll try to understand who Eric and Lyle Menendez really were. Victims of circumstance or calculating, ruthless criminals. You'll hear how therapists betrayed their own patients, what Michael Jackson, Rambo, and cable television have to do with the case, and why the Menendez brothers might soon be free. This is Serial Files, a series where we explore killers and criminals through the lens of history, culture, and politics. My co-host Alex will help me break it down. So, Eric and Lyle Menendez and their parents, the protagonists of episode 3.
On a warm evening in Beverly Hills, August 20th, 1989, a brutal double murder took place. In their lavish mansion, Jose and Kitty Menendez were killed. Jose was known as a shark in the entertainment industry. He ran a major film company. By grim irony, at the time of the attack, the couple was sitting at home watching a movie. They were executed with shocking cruelty. Jose was shot with a shotgun at least 4 times, Kitty 9 times. Their bodies were torn apart. One officer who rushed to the scene later said he had seen many murders before, but never this level of brutality. Pools of blood, mangled remains, and we'll be returning to these details because in this case, they matter. At first, police couldn't make sense of who could have done this. An elite city, a luxury neighborhood, and a slaughter that looked like something straight out of Scarface. A hit job, a public execution, yet there were no signs of forced entry or robbery, and something stood out. Both victims had their legs shot as well. Maybe torture before death? Reporters began talking about mafia ties, and it was believable. But first we need to understand who Jose Menendez was and how he rose to success. Like Tony Montana in Scarface, Jose came to the US from Cuba. At first he washed dishes in restaurants, then worked his way up and made serious money. But that's where the parallels with Al Pacino's character end. Jose hadn't been poor in Cuba. He was born into a successful family of an athlete and entrepreneur. He likely would have stayed on the island if not for the Cuban Revolution. When Castro took power, his parents sent him to relatives in the US for safety. In the 20 years after the revolution, over 500,000 Cubans moved to the States, the largest wave of Cuban emigration in history. And contrary to the stereotype of desperate refugees paddling to Florida, the first wave was different. It was Cuba's elite and middle class. In the US, this even had a name: the Golden Exile. American authorities encouraged it, passing laws in the 60s that let Cubans quickly get permanent resident status. Still, Jose had to start from the bottom. He lived in an attic at his cousin's house, washed dishes, and worked at an elite Manhattan restaurant with a long history. Almost every US president had dined there, and the wine cellar held bottles owned by stars like Elizabeth Taylor and Sophia Loren. Maybe that's where young Jose caught the idea of success. He had reason to dream. He studied economics in New York, landed a solid job at an accounting firm, and then was noticed by RCA, Radio Corporation of America. This media giant launched NBC, the oldest U.S. television network, under the leadership of David Sarnoff, himself an immigrant, from the Minsk province of the Russian Empire. As a young radio operator, Sarnoff transmitted signals from the Titanic rescue ships in 1912. 40 years later, he arranged the broadcast of the famous Nixon-Khrushchev meeting in Moscow. Sarnoff is considered one of the fathers of American television. Why mention this? It matters for what comes later. At RCA, Jose first ran a rental car subsidiary, then was promoted to head of the record division. By 1980, he was making $500,000 a year. In 1963, he had married Mary Louise, Kitty, a beauty queen from Illinois. Their first son, Lyle, was born in 1968, followed by Eric in 1970. Jose bought his first mansion near Princeton, New Jersey. Later, when his business faced trouble, he moved the family to California, closer to Hollywood. There he became an executive at Carol Co. Pictures, a studio older viewers will remember from VHS tapes. The logo that came before Rambo, Universal Soldier, Terminator 2, Basic Instinct, and Air America. At Carol Co., Jose's income quadrupled. The family moved into a Beverly Hills mansion previously rented by Elton John, Michael Jackson, and even a Saudi prince. Jose simply bought it. Mediterranean style, 8 bedrooms, a pool, guest house, tennis court, a private home theater. It was in that theater room that Jose and Kitty were murdered. And this brings us back to the mafia angle. After the killings, journalists joked darkly that half of Hollywood must have been working on alibis. Jose's business style had earned him enemies. He was ruthless, arrogant, and enjoyed showing rivals that he wasn't afraid. One example? With his push, Carol Co. swallowed up several smaller studios. One of them had produced adult films, and its owner was likely tied to the Italian mob. Cosa Nostra controlled pornography distribution at the time. After the buyout, a money dispute erupted. The ex-owner felt cheated, ripped off. Add Jose's arrogance, and it wasn't hard to imagine the porn magnate calling in a made man to settle scores and send a message. Even relatives of the murdered couple suspected a business feud. Their own sons said as much. Maybe their father had crossed the wrong people. At the time of the murders, Eric was 19, Lyle 21. They were the ones who called the police that night, claiming they'd returned home near midnight to find their parents' bodies. For a while afterward, they lived in hotels. Lyle insisted he was being followed, even hired bodyguards. Police did dig into Jose's business ties, questioning colleagues, even Sylvester Stallone, who sat on Carol Co.'s board. They also interviewed figures with known mafia connections. But as time would prove, the most dangerous people in this story were not the Italian mob.
More than 10 shotgun blasts. In the middle of a quiet Beverly Hills evening. How could nobody hear? They did. Neighbors thought it was just fireworks. The idea that someone was being gunned down with a shotgun next door never crossed their minds. In 1989, Beverly Hills recorded only 2 murders all year, and they were Jose and Kitty Menendez. For comparison, other parts of Los Angeles averaged 15 murders per district, and South Central was a war zone. But Beverly Hills was old money, quiet luxury, and suddenly there were brains scattered across a mansion. The cops were on edge, though at first they made a serious mistake, which we'll come back to. Later, detectives admitted the mafia theory never fully convinced them. Cosa Nostra pros wouldn't have left such a mess. One clean shot, discreet, maybe at a restaurant, that was their style. We actually talked about this in our previous video on the mafia and the movies. Check it out if you're interested. And mafia codes forbade killing wives. Add the cartoonish detail of shooting the victims in the legs. It all looked like someone trying way too hard to stage a mob hit. If not gangsters or robbers, then who? With no signs of forced entry, suspicion naturally fell on those closest to the victims, their sons. Motive? Obvious. Money. The Menendez estate was worth about $15 million at the time, around $40 million today. Real estate, stocks, jewelry, Mercedes cars, and cash. And the will left everything to the boys. But motive alone isn't proof. In their first police interviews, Lyle and Eric said they had gone to the movies that night, then stopped by a fair in Santa Monica. At first, police accepted it. Still, they kept an eye on them, and with good reason. At funerals, in press interviews, in conversations with friends, the brothers gushed about their parents. We loved them. We respected them. We wanted to be just like our father and continue his work. Sometimes it sounded almost forced. If Lyle and I had been home that night, maybe my dad would still be alive and I'd be dead. I would have gladly given my life for him. They even called their father a Cuban Nelson Mandela, claiming he planned to run for Senate and one day the presidency to save Cuba from communism. The brothers compared themselves to the Kennedys. In reality, they blew through their father's money. Lyle spent $500,000 buying a Princeton cafe that wasn't worth nearly that much. He tried to poach rival staff by handing couriers $100 bills outside competitors' doors, dreaming of a national chain. He bought a Porsche for $65,000. Eric settled for a $20,000 Jeep. They shopped for Rolexes and ate at the most expensive restaurants. In just 2 months, they burned through about $1 million, extravagant even by Beverly Hills standards. They didn't exactly look like grieving children, which fueled suspicion. But grief hits differently. Maybe they were coping with trauma through cars and watches. Much of what they spent came from Jose's life insurance. They got $650,000 immediately, though a corporate policy worth $15 million went to the company. That even led some relatives to suspect the firm itself of arranging the murders. The will was another issue. Friends told police Jose had been thinking of cutting his sons out. He was disappointed in their behavior, their spending, their grades, their girlfriends. Somehow the brothers may have learned of it. After the murders, Lyle hired a computer expert to access his father's files. The documents were empty, so he asked him to just delete them, highly suspicious. But police needed more than hunches. And that's when Eric slipped. He confessed to his best friend in detail. The friend wasn't sure whether to believe him, but went to police just in case. After all, it's not every day someone admits to killing their parents. He also told investigators about a screenplay he and Eric had written the year before, about a son murdering his parents for inheritance. Eric's own mother, Kitty, had even helped him type it. She never imagined she'd end up playing the second lead. Police wired the friend for sound and asked him to get Eric to talk again. This time, Eric backed down, no confession, another dead end. But soon it turned out Eric hadn't just told one person.
In March 1990, a woman named Judeline Smith came forward to police. She was a friend of psychotherapist Jerome Oziel, who had been seeing Eric. She told detectives that first Eric and then Lyle had confessed to Oziel that they killed their parents, and that Lyle had even threatened to kill the doctor if it didn't keep quiet. Police immediately stormed Oziel's office. He confirmed everything and admitted he had audio tapes of the brothers' confessions. And then came the cherry on top. A former college friend of Lyle turned in a spent shotgun shell he said he'd found in Lyle's jacket pocket. The caliber matched the murder weapon. It was all so damning that police didn't wait. On March 8th, they arrested Lyle. He didn't resist. Eric, meanwhile, was away playing in a tennis tournament in Israel. 3 days later, he returned to the US and surrendered. The brothers were charged. For a double parricide, the death penalty was very much on the table. It all looked straightforward, until it wasn't. After the arrests, the wider Menendez family closed ranks. Uncles, cousins, even the grandmother, all insisted to the press that Lyle and Eric were innocent. They accused police of a rush to judgment and kept pushing the mafia theory. And the brothers themselves? They didn't crack. They pled not guilty and hired a powerhouse defense team. The standout was Leslie Abramson. She wasn't afraid to argue with judges, to tell off reporters, and she had the track record to back it up. Of her 14 prior clients facing either the death penalty or life in prison, she had saved 13. She'd even defended a doctor accused of killing and dismembering his own 11-year-old son, and got him acquitted after proving it was actually the boy's uncle who had done it. She once defended a man who shot his father, a media mogul, convincing the jury that years of abuse had driven the son over the edge. He walked away with probation, not a death sentence. For the Menendez trial, Abramson represented Eric, and she immediately went after the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, those therapy tapes. Could they even be used in court? Everyone knows from movies, if nowhere else, that what you say to your therapist is supposed to stay private. Doctor-patient confidentiality. But by the 1990s, almost every state had carved out exceptions. Courts had ruled that confidentiality ends where public safety begins. If a patient poses a real danger to themselves or others, the therapist not only may, but must alert authorities. There had been real cases where patients told psychologists they planned to kill someone, and then did, while police and the victims were left in the dark. In many states, the duty went even further. Therapists were required to report any suspected abuse of children or the elderly. In Texas, doctors were outright compelled to answer police questions in criminal cases. In California, where this case played out, the law said a doctor could break confidentiality if a patient posed a danger to someone. And according to Oziel, the brothers had threatened him. So why did Abramson fight so hard? Her point was that these laws were designed to prevent future crimes. If the brothers had come to Oziel before the murders and said they planned to kill their parents, fine, no argument, call the cops. But by the time of their confession, the victims were already dead. There was no threat left to stop. So the defense argued the conversations should have remained protected. On top of that, police hadn't learned about the tapes directly from Oziel, but from his girlfriend, a third party with no legal right to reveal anything. That, Abramson argued, made the evidence tainted, like an illegal search or wiretap. Even if it turned up incriminating proof, the jury shouldn't see it. This legal battle dragged on for 2.5 years. Finally, the California Supreme Court ruled that part of Oziel's recordings could be admitted. After that came the slow, painstaking jury selection. And only in the summer of 1993, 3 years after the brothers were first arrested, did the full trial of Lyle and Eric Menendez finally begin.
The trial was overseen by Judge Weisberg, who was no stranger to high-profile cases. While the Menendez brothers waited for their day in court, Los Angeles erupted in riots. It started with what seemed like a routine police stop. Rodney King, a young black man, had been drinking, smoking, and watching basketball with friends. Driving home, he sped, got pulled over, and decided not to stop. He was on parole for robbery and didn't want another run-in with the cops. When police finally caught him, they ordered him out of the car. According to them, King resisted. The result? More than 50 baton blows, plus a couple of taser shocks. He ended up in the hospital with a broken facial bone, a fractured ankle, and countless cuts and bruises. Unfortunately for the officers, a nearby resident filmed the beating and leaked it to the media. The footage became an instant bombshell, later appearing in music videos, documentaries, and films. Authorities tried to calm the outrage by charging 4 officers with assault and excessive force. Judge Weisberg presided over that case too. The verdict? Acquittal. Even President George H.W. Bush expressed shock, but it was too late. Los Angeles exploded. For nearly a week, the city was on fire. Looting, arson, and open street battles left more than 60 people dead, mostly black residents. Nearly 3,000 injured and almost $1 billion in damage. In the middle of the chaos, Rodney King himself went on TV and pleaded for peace. But nobody was listening. The beating was just the spark. Resentment toward police brutality had been boiling for years, especially since the LAPD cleanup before the '84 Olympics. Complaints about excessive force had skyrocketed, especially against ordinary kids who looked suspicious. But the riots weren't just outrage. They drew in opportunists who looted the city in broad daylight. The King case burned its way into American culture, referenced in films from Malcolm X to South Central. King later sued the city and won nearly $4 million in damages. Did he turn his life around, find God, start a business? No. 13 years ago, he died of an overdose, and yet the King case left a lasting mark. It also exposed how differently the LAPD treated different communities, which became painfully clear in the Menendez case. On the night of the murders, detectives didn't even test the brothers' hands for gunpowder residue, a routine procedure in any homicide. They didn't impound the brothers' car, parked right outside the house, even though the boys later admitted it held shell casings from the murder. Eric even slipped up in an early interview, claiming he had seen smoke from the gunshots, an impossible detail to notice 90 minutes later in a room with shattered windows. Still, the Beverly Hills cops said they didn't want to pressure 2 grieving sons. Why subject the boys to humiliating tests and harsh questioning? Maybe they were just too relaxed. Beverly Hills only had 2 murders that entire year. More likely, it was the magic of the zip code. This wasn't South Central. This was the land of old money where cops tread lightly, but their gentleness crossed into negligence. If they'd acted properly, the case would have been cracked within hours. Eventually, the brothers were charged. Premeditated murder and conspiracy to commit murder. No crimes of passion, just cold, calculated brutality. Prosecutors argued the story was simple. Lyle and Eric bought shotguns in advance, staged alibis by calling their tennis coach and talking about a movie in Carnival, then went home and executed their parents. Afterwards, they disposed of the guns, shells, and bloody clothes and put on a show of grief. The prosecution had the tapes and testimony from Dr. Oziel and his girlfriend. According to them, the brothers claimed their mother was miserable and couldn't live without their father. That killing her was almost like euthanasia. Right, euthanasia via shotgun. They said she was also just an unnecessary witness. Oziel's girlfriend testified that the brothers bragged about pulling off the perfect murder and that their father would have been proud. Well, if they hadn't blown his head off. Prosecutors hammered on the sheer brutality. Photos from the scene showed contact wounds, where the barrel was pressed directly against the skin. Detectives called them rat holes. Imagine it. Sons pressing a shotgun to their parents' heads before pulling the trigger. The guns were never found, but by then it didn't matter. The brothers confessed. Yes, they bought the shotguns. Yes, they lied about the movie in Carnival. Yes, they picked up the casings and ditched the weapons on Mulholland Drive. Case closed? Not even close. What followed wasn't a dry courtroom formality. It was a full-blown national spectacle.
While rioters torched the streets of Los Angeles, the Menendez brothers nearly burned themselves inside county jail while awaiting trial. At one point, guards suspected them of plotting an escape. They searched the cells and found a letter from Lyle to Eric, and it was damning. In it, Lyle openly discussed details of the murders. Why would he handwrite evidence against himself? Simple, he thought Eric would read it and destroy it. Eric didn't. Oops. By the time the trial began, the defense strategy had shifted. Lyle and Eric admitted to the killings. There was no point denying it anymore, but they argued this wasn't about greed. According to them, they believed their father had already changed his will, so they had no inheritance to expect. As for the $650,000 insurance payout, they claimed they didn't even know about it until after his death. So what motive was left? Their lawyers said it was survival. For years, the brothers had been beaten down, humiliated, and abused by their parents. In this version, Lyle and Eric weren't cold-blooded killers, they were victims. So who exactly was Jose Menendez? By all accounts, a controlling, authoritarian perfectionist. He loved to say, "There's no loser blood in my veins." It was the philosophy of a corporate shark who lived by faster, higher, stronger. You're either number one or you're nothing. People who worked with him rarely had kind words. Even the prosecutor later admitted the only person she found who spoke well of Jose was his secretary. And the way he ran his business, he ran his family. No excuses, no softness. Dinner was less a family meal than a boardroom briefing. Jose grilled his sons on politics and economics, and if they couldn't keep up, they'd better go study. He lived through them. When Lyle was admitted to Princeton, it was Jose's dream come true, since he himself had never gotten into the Ivy League. When Lyle was suspended, Jose saw it as a personal humiliation. He even demanded his son not come home, worried someone might find out his boy wasn't good enough. Eric, meanwhile, attended the top school in Beverly Hills, the same place where Beverly Hills 90210 was filmed. Both brothers were pushed in sports, especially swimming and tennis. But no matter how hard they trained, it was never enough. Win a tournament? Fine. Go win a bigger one. They described a life of constant pressure and belittlement, afraid to show weakness to a father who only valued strength. But let's be clear. Pressure and perfectionism alone don't explain parricide. Plenty of celebrities talk about traumatizing childhoods in mansions. Taylor Swift has written for years about growing up in what she calls a psych ward, a 350 square meter house. Victoria Beckham jokes her working-class dad drove her to school in a Rolls-Royce, but they didn't buy shotguns. What set the Menendez household apart was the violence. Jose didn't just spank his kids. He hit them with fists, shoved their heads underwater in the pool, pulled their hair, and, according to court testimony, once punched a young Lyle in the face simply because the boy irritated him. Kitty didn't protect them, she egged him on. She kept lists of offenses so Jose could punish the boys. The humiliations were constant. Lyle, who struggled with bedwetting until 14, was forced to eat breakfast with his soiled sheets laid out on the table. Once, after Kitty cut herself, she smeared her blood across Lyle's face and made him sit at dinner that way. Another time, when Lyle secretly kept a pet rabbit, Jose killed it with his bare hands in front of him. The family atmosphere was suffocating. Jose cheated openly. Kitty drowned her rage in alcohol and pills. She told her sons she regretted having them, sometimes screaming that she wished the whole family would just die. According to the brothers, she raged, smashed objects, and once threatened to poison them all. By the defense's account, Jose was domineering and abusive, Kitty unstable and cruel. But even that wasn't the full story. And here we arrive at the darkest part of the case. The brothers said that their father regularly, I won't say this word, but you understand. Lyle had to endure this from the age of 6 to 8. Then the parent shifted his attention to the younger one. Eric was less lucky. His father, let's put it this way, did the same thing to him for 12 years, right up until his death. We will not go into details. Let's just say that in addition to direct contact, Jose used improvised objects, like a truly twisted aggressor. The brothers cried when they told about this in court. At first, the children even perceived this nightmare almost as a sign of love because they lacked simple human attention from their father. One day, Lyle repeated the same pattern with Eric in the forest. The 6-year-old thought it was normal, and right in the courtroom, he apologized to his brother for it. Wait, these are the words of 2 cold-blooded killers. Could they have made it all up to paint themselves in a better light? Who else could confirm such darkness? Relatives, friends, and acquaintances admitted in court that there were problems in the household. Jose was unfaithful. Kitty did lose her temper. And most importantly, the children were treated harshly, subjected to public humiliation, ridicule, and physical violence. For example, Kitty's brother-in-law personally saw their father strike one of the boys. A family friend witnessed it too. Lyle was 9 at the time, crying when his father kicked him in the stomach. But what about the alleged abuse? Was there any truth to those claims? Most of the family's circle had never seen anything like it. Yet the brother's cousin testified. Lyle came into my room and asked if he could stay. He said he was afraid to sleep in his own bed because his father and he had done things there. I won't name them here, but you can guess what he meant. This was in the summer of '76. Lyle was 8, and their cousin was spending the holidays with them. The girl told the brother's mother everything, but Kitty dismissed it as nonsense and took her son away. If we believe the cousin, Eric and Lyle even argued over who would sleep in their mother's bed when their father wasn't home. By then they were already 12 and 15. Later the brothers admitted they also had some very questionable interactions with Kitty. Let's leave it at that. Their cousin, Andy Cano, gave similar testimony. When Eric was 13, he confided that something was happening with his father. I won't spell it out, but you get the idea. The boy didn't know if it was normal, so he asked his brother, "Does your dad do that too?" As evidence, the defense presented photographs of Lyle and Eric in compromising situations, allegedly taken by Jose himself. The details of those pictures are better left unsaid. But even if all this was true, questions remain. At the time of the murders, Eric was almost 19, not 10, not 15 when you're trapped with no way out. Lyle was 21. They weren't locked in a basement. The older brother could have taken Eric to relatives or to Princeton, gone to the police, told everything. From a strictly legal standpoint, no abuse, no matter how horrific, justifies such a brutal double murder. The lawyers knew this, which is why they framed it as self-defense. But self-defense? According to their own story, the violence had happened long before that night. No weapons were found near the bodies. Jose and Kitty were watching a movie at the time. So what exactly were the parents sitting in front of the TV threatening their sons with? A bucket of ice cream? Some strawberries? Or the Michael Jackson cassette that was lying on the table in the room where it all happened? Why didn't the brothers just walk away?
When Eric Menendez was asked why he and his brother never tried to escape from their father, the violent tyrant ruling their home, he gave a curious explanation. "I grew up believing I could never get away. That thought was drilled deep into my brain. Don't forget, my father was successful, wealthy, powerful. a strong personality, and no one could stop him. His brother added, "There was no place we could go where our parents wouldn't find us, and with his money and influence, he could have easily made the police look the other way. Sure, he was rich and influential, but he wasn't the president of the United States or the head of a global corporation. It's hard to believe he had the kind of protection that could have erased accusations of abusing his own children." But back then, the defendants were nervous young men, fragile in front of the court. Psychologists later noted that Lyle and Eric were emotionally stunted. Even in their 20s, they acted more like teenagers. Which isn't surprising, given the total control their parents kept over them. Maybe in theory they could have fled to Europe, but how would they have survived there? One phone call from Jose to the bank, and their accounts would be frozen. They feared no one would believe them, and that their father would take brutal revenge. On top of that, there was the psychological dependence. Sadly, we know too many cases where victims of domestic abuse stay with their abuser, not because they are physically locked up, but because they are mentally trapped. They just can't bring themselves to leave. This doesn't excuse murder, especially not one so brutal, but it does help us understand the mindset the brothers described. Eric once tried to resist. Jose responded by holding a massive knife to his throat and threatening, "If you act out, I'll kill you, and if you tell anyone, I'll kill them too." According to Eric, the knife was either a replica or perhaps the very same blade that Sylvester Stallone used as Rambo. After that, Eric realized his father wasn't bluffing. Still, age was catching up with him. By 18, he was supposed to be preparing for college. For Eric, school seemed like a safe path, finally a way out, but not so fast. He planned to attend UCLA just 5 hours from home. His father immediately warned him that he'd still be coming home every weekend. That's when Eric understood his father wasn't letting him go. Around the same time, Lyle had his own blow-up with their mother. During an argument, Kitty ripped off his toupee. He had started balding early and kept it hidden. Eric didn't even know until then. That same evening, the brothers sat down for an unusually raw conversation. For the first time, they admitted to each other how unbearable life had become. This was just 5 days before the murders. Lyle confessed that he knew their father had abused Eric, but assumed it had stopped years earlier. That's when Eric admitted it hadn't. It was still happening. Just days before, Lyle confronted Jose, who dismissed him with something like, "He's my son, I'll do whatever I want with him. Mind your own business and go back to college." Their mother chimed in, admitting she had always known, and repeated her favorite line, "It would have been better if you'd never been born." The pressure inside the family reached breaking point. Lyle kept threatening to expose his father, and soon the brothers convinced themselves their parents wanted to get rid of them. They even feared for their lives. They knew there were hunting rifles in the house. The day before the murders, Jose and Kitty invited the boys to go fishing. Sharks of all things? The brothers later said they thought their parents might just feed them to the sharks. They believed they were saved only because other people were on the boat. Then came the day of the murders. Lyle tried to discuss tennis with his father. Jose brushed him off. That doesn't matter anymore. The brothers heard that as another threat. They started to leave the house, but Jose ordered them to stay and told Eric to come into his bedroom. For the first time, Lyle snapped in front of everyone. "Don't you dare touch my brother!" Jose grew furious. Kitty then said the family would never heal because Eric had already told. At that, Jose grabbed her by the hand, dragged her into a room, and slammed the door shut. This, the brothers later said, was the deadly threat they perceived in that moment. They were convinced Jose and Kitty were arming themselves with rifles and would come out shooting. Eric remembered his father's threats, that he'd kill him and anyone he told. So the brothers grabbed their shotguns, ran to the car for more shells, then stormed back inside. What happened next varied in their testimony, but the general picture was clear. It was dark. They could only see their parents' silhouettes. Jose was either standing still or moving toward them. The brothers opened fire until the shells were gone. Chaos, panic, shooting at anything that moved. Lyle admitted he put a shot into his father's head at point-blank range, but insisted it was an accident. Then they reloaded outside and came back, with Lyle firing one last shot into his mother, unsure if she was already dead. Only later did they realize there were no rifles in the parents' room at all. But by then, it was done. They expected the police to arrive immediately. Instead, neighbors assumed the gunfire was just fireworks. So the brothers disposed of the weapons and bloody clothes, cooked up the alibi about the movie and the fair, and called the cops. Does that sound like self-defense? Hardly. That's why their lawyers rolled out the concept of imperfect self-defense, when someone believes they're in mortal danger and lashes out violently, even if objectively there was no threat. Trauma clouds judgment, and that, the defense argued, was the case here. Not an invention by the Menendez team either. The same argument had been used by women on trial for killing abusive husbands. Years of beatings, threats, humiliation, and then one night they snapped, shooting their husbands in their sleep, or stabbing them while they watched TV. Attorney Leslie Abramson leaned hard on this approach for the Menendez brothers. Objectively, no guns were aimed at them that night, but subjectively, in their minds, the threat was real. And who put that fear into their minds? Their parents. But then why did the brothers hide the weapons? Why invent an alibi? Why weep in front of cops and wax poetic about their parents at the funeral? The defense had an answer for that too. They feared no one would believe them, and who wants to end up in prison? Even if it was technically self-defense, a prison term still seemed inevitable. All right, maybe the imperfect self-defense theory had a leg to stand on. But what about the testimony of Dr. Oziel, their psychotherapist, and his girlfriend? She had gone to the police and told them everything. According to her, the brothers didn't just confess, they bragged about carrying out the perfect murder. Yet once she was on the stand, her story flipped completely. She became a witness for the defense. What happened there? Was she intimidated? Or maybe promised a cut of the inheritance?
An important detail. Eric Menendez had confessed the murders to his psychotherapist back in October 1989, but the doctor's girlfriend only went to the police in March the following year. Why the delay? To understand that, you need to know why she came forward at all. Judalon Smith claimed that Dr. Jerome Oziel, the therapist, had manipulated her into an abusive relationship, drugging her, coercing her into sex, and holding her against her will, all while married with children. When she threatened to report him, he warned her he'd paint her as a psychotic stalker. Oziel told police she was just seeking revenge after their breakup, which had ended in March, right before she went to the cops. And along the way, she mentioned what she'd heard about the brothers. But why had Eric gone to this particular therapist in the first place? It wasn't about trust. He just needed to unburden himself. And he already knew Oziel. After the Menendez family moved to Calabasas, one of the wealthiest towns in America, the brothers quickly got into trouble. Like other spoiled rich kids, they started breaking into neighbors' homes. Caught by police, they faced charges, but Jose cut a deal. Everything was pinned on the younger son, and Eric, as a minor, got community service and mandatory therapy. Jose personally chose Oziel and signed an agreement requiring him to report back on everything Eric revealed, a calculated move given their family dynamics. When police learned of Oziel's alleged abuse of Smith, they did nothing. No case. Later, Smith changed her story in court, suddenly unsure she'd even heard confessions or threats from the brothers, and suggesting Oziel might have planted those ideas in their minds. He hadn't, but he certainly didn't rush to police. Instead, he coaxed the brothers into repeating details on tape, behavior that looked less like care and more like exploitation. From the start, the trial created a media storm. Media storm almost feels too soft. The Menendez brothers were everywhere. News, talk shows, even parody by John Malkovich and Rob Schneider on Saturday Night Live. The trial became a soap opera America couldn't look away from. Prosecutors were flooded with advice calls, 50 a day, and then came the game changer: cameras in the courtroom. Judge Weisberg allowed full coverage, opening the Pandora's box of televised trials. Remember Dustin Hoffman's character in Rain Man, addicted to courtroom TV? By 1993, millions of Americans became collective Rain Men, glued to court TV, a cable channel dedicated solely to trials. The Menendez case made it a national sensation. Every Friday, two journalists recapped the week, one sympathetic to the brothers' abuse claims, the other backing the prosecution. Good cop, bad cop for the audience, only deepened the divide. Some viewers sobbed, saying, "They're so sincere, so broken, I can't help but believe them." Others scoffed. Spoiled sadists. They slaughtered their parents for money, and now they're crying in court in expensive sweaters. And like the audience of an interactive drama, it fell to the jurors to decide how this true crime soap opera of the 1990s would end.
2 killers and 2 victims. That's why the Menendez case had 2 separate juries. They had to reach multiple verdicts. One for the father's murder, another for the mother's. The prosecution argued this: the brothers coldly executed their parents with extreme cruelty for the sake of an inheritance. Their father had planned to cut them out of the will because they had disappointed him. The brothers planned everything in advance, tried to cover their tracks, and then lied to police, relatives, and journalists. There were also testimonies from the housekeeper and the pool cleaner. They hadn't noticed anything criminal. On the contrary, they said the brothers often acted disrespectfully toward their parents. But come on, it's 1993 in California. Are we really going to excuse a double execution as self-defense? What were they so afraid of? These weren't scared kids, said the prosecution, but calculating, greedy sadists and hypocrites who deserved the death penalty. Then came the defense. These boys were humiliated and abused for years, especially Eric. Eventually they broke. Their minds were warped by trauma. They truly believed they were in mortal danger. Even closed doors behind which their parents might be plotting against them could have been a trigger. Money wasn't the motive. They were convinced they were no longer in the will. Their father told them so, and the estate's trustee confirmed it in court. Yes, they prepared, but they prepared for self-defense. Their later lies and behavior? That was shock, fear, and trauma. Would calculating killers really go confess to a half-stranger, and only months after the crime? Why didn't they talk about the abuse earlier? Because it was humiliating and painful. Easier to admit to murder than to reveal that. They didn't want to drag the family name through the mud. They didn't want the tabloids to feast on their private misery. Lyle even said he'd rather be executed than expose those secrets. That's why he pushed others to lie for him. Better that than admit his own father had abused him. No one is asking for acquittal. Yes, they killed their parents, but there are clear mitigating circumstances. A limited prison term is enough. That was the defense's case. So we end up with the words of prosecutors versus the words of attorneys. Everyone had their own truth, but we've overlooked the supposed smoking gun, the audio tapes. Some of them were allowed in court. They were supposed to bring clarity. Instead, they complicated everything. On tape, Lyle admitted that they killed their mother partly out of pity. She was suffering, he said. There was nothing concrete about fear of the parents or abuse, but there was also nothing about money or inheritance. Here's a telling fragment from Eric's recorded confession. My father was someone I loved, but I had almost no choice but to do what I did. I hate myself for it, but I can't rationally process it. It's just in my head. And here's the kicker. These tapes were introduced not by the prosecution, but by the defense. Their point was that even the recordings prosecutors made such a fuss over did not prove the murders were for money. They only proved the crime was planned, which left the juries with an impossible task. They had 4 options. First, was it first or second-degree murder? If it was premeditated and aggravated, that meant death or life without parole. If not, it could be voluntary manslaughter, a killing provoked by circumstances where the defendant couldn't control his emotions, or even involuntary manslaughter, a negligent killing like a fatal car accident with a sentence of just 2 to 4 years. On top of that, jurors had to decide whether the brothers had conspired together to kill. So what happened? In pure courtroom drama fashion, the jury split right down the middle. Both panels deadlocked 6-6 between first, second-degree murder and manslaughter. One of Lyle's jurors even voted for involuntary manslaughter, basically an accident in his mother's killing. Eric's jury leaned harsher, especially regarding Kitty's death. 8 for murder, 4 for manslaughter. According to some jurors, gender made the difference. Men tended to vote for harsher charges, but either way, the juries couldn't agree. After nearly a month, over 1,000 hours of deliberation, they remained stuck. Judge Weisberg kept asking, "Where are you?" and kept hearing, "We're deadlocked, Your Honor." In the end, the deadline ran out, and since a verdict required unanimity, Weisberg had no choice but to declare a mistrial. The great American courtroom drama was renewed for a second season.
On the eve of the second trial, Eric Menendez asked the state to pay for his private lawyer, the famous Leslie Abramson. Was he joking? Jose, after all, never changed his will. Wasn't $15 million enough? Did they also want to squeeze more money out of taxpayers? In reality, by the mid-1990s, the Menendez fortune had already shrunk to crumbs. First, the value of their real estate collapsed. Who would want to live in a house where such a horrific murder had taken place? The Beverly Hills mansion was sold only at a fire sale price. Jose's stock portfolio also fell apart. Add mortgages, taxes, and all sorts of other payments. Just the lawyers cost $1.5 million. In the end, the brothers were left with a house in Calabasas worth $2,700,000 in cash and some smaller assets. But with mounting debts and future payouts, even selling the house wouldn't save them. They'd still end up in the red. Of course, that only mattered if they were somehow acquitted, and under California law, a killer cannot inherit from their victim anyway. That's why the brothers burned through their father's insurance payout immediately after the murder. They probably understood back then that nothing else would ever come their way. For the second trial, the judge excluded witnesses who had earlier testified about abuse in the family. Most experts backing the brothers' claims of fear were also struck from the defense list. Abramson protested, calling them key witnesses, but the judge was unyielding. Alleged abuse was not directly connected to the crime. Abramson fought on. She managed to call a psychologist who diagnosed Eric with PTSD, similar to Vietnam veterans. Constant trauma could make someone lash out violently even without a real threat. Like Stallone's Rambo, harassed by cops, but instead of fleeing, he unleashed chaos on a small town. For Eric, Vietnam was replaced by his father's belt and harassment. On this basis, the judge ordered a separate psychiatric exam. Conducted by noted expert Park Elliott Dietz, it concluded that Eric had no PTSD, only anxiety disorder at most. Not enough trauma to distort reality and provoke murder. Dietz said that in panic, people usually run from danger, not toward it. By that logic, the brothers should have bolted to their car to escape, not reloaded shotguns and returned to kill. The defense countered that Dietz was a prosecution doctor, usually hired to prove criminals sane in big trials. He had been an expert in the case of Jeffrey Dahmer, the infamous serial killer and cannibal, so they questioned his objectivity. And while he didn't confirm, he also didn't deny that abuse might have happened. Still, Lyle's own admission that he accidentally, but very precisely shot his parents in the head hardly helped the defense. By then, defense strategy had shifted. They claimed Lyle wasn't defending himself, but acting out of extreme emotional turmoil, furious at his father's treatment of Eric. He stormed into the room with a shotgun, driven by a mix of rage and fear, a state of temporary insanity. A separate courtroom battle broke out over the shooting itself. The prosecution called 2 private experts who staged a full reconstruction. According to them, Jose was killed with a shot to the back of the head while sitting on the couch. That meant someone came up from behind, pressed the gun to his skull, and pulled the trigger. Later shots to his limbs were staged to make it look like a mob hit. Most of Kitty's wounds, they said, were inflicted while she was already lying down. That looked more like an execution than chaotic panic fire. The coroner's report indeed said the parents were killed at point-blank range. That partly confirmed the reconstruction, though even the coroner couldn't specify how many shots, in what sequence, or whether the victims were moving. And this wasn't Victorian London of the 19th century. This was California in the 1990s. Technology was supposed to be better. The judge drew his conclusion. The defense had failed to prove the brothers genuinely feared for their lives. This was especially true for Eric, whose lawyers stuck to the imperfect self-defense theory. The judge even barred Abramson from giving her final plea to the jury. What's more, when it came to Jose's murder, jurors could choose first-degree or lesser charges like manslaughter, as in the first trial. But for Kitty, the only option was first-degree murder or acquittal, nothing in between. Lyle's lawyer pleaded for a split verdict, not guilty of first-degree murder of his mother, guilty of manslaughter in his father's death. Supporters still argue that the phrasing of the jury questions was judicial pressure, denying them the option of manslaughter in Kitty's case. Theoretically, the brothers could have gone free only if fully acquitted of both murders, a fantasy given their confessions. Even the defense didn't ask for that. In the end, the jury unanimously convicted the brothers of first-degree murder with special circumstances, premeditated plus conspiracy to kill both parents. The verdict came in March 1996. Half the battle was done. Now came the penalty phase, life without parole, or the death penalty, as prosecutors demanded. The nation held its breath. By then, the Menendez case had dragged on for 6 years. Endless disputes over tapes, 2 trials, hundreds of witnesses, dozens of experts. On verdict day, the courthouse was stormed by journalists and citizens. Firefighters were called to push the crowd back. Finally, the jury spared the brothers' lives. Officially, it was due to their young age and clean records. Unofficially, pity clearly played a role. Some jurors even cried when delivering the verdict. The decision felt almost like an acquittal. The brothers smiled and hugged their lawyers. Abramson said Eric had become like a son to her. Relatives of the defendants wept with relief. But they weren't the only ones crying. One juror, a 36-year-old postal worker, explained, "We felt the parents were very controlling, demanding. The brothers didn't have a normal childhood. We believed there was psychological abuse, maybe even more. I don't think we'll ever know the full truth." Killed? Yes. Brutally? No doubt. But people still pitied the boys. At the time, the justice system was reeling from other failures. Above all, the O.J. Simpson case. The football star and actor was accused of killing his ex-wife and her friend. His infamous car chase, lasting nearly 3 hours, was broadcast live nationwide. Some 5 million people watched, compared to 90 million for the Super Bowl that year. For a while, Simpson overshadowed the Menendez brothers. His trial came between theirs. Jose Menendez had even hired him years earlier for a rental car ad. Simpson had visited their home and later sat in jail at the same time as the brothers. But unlike them, Simpson was acquitted despite ample evidence. The public was outraged. What kind of justice was this, letting a killer walk free? Authorities needed to restore credibility with a showcase conviction. The Menendez brothers became that showcase. To this day, supporters insist Simpson's acquittal indirectly doomed them. Just like Simpson's trial, the Menendez story split America in two. Some said, "Good, they deserved it. Shame they weren't executed." Others sent letters of support and even declarations of love to the brothers.
After the verdict, the Menendez brothers were sent to different prisons, and that's where their notoriety turned against them. Other inmates didn't take kindly to the pretty rich boys who had killed their parents. Lyle had his jaw broken in prison, Eric was cornered and harassed, and though he tried to fight back, he ended up in solitary. Still, they didn't lose spirit. Letters poured in from fans, especially women. Both brothers eventually married while behind bars, just like Ted Bundy once did. Lyle even divorced and remarried. Eric's wife bought a house near his prison so she could visit him more often, and he was granted 4 visits a week. Unlike Bundy, the FBI didn't profile the brothers, but pop culture latched on immediately. TV, movies, and series about the Menendez case appeared as early as 1994. In Jim Carrey's film The Cable Guy, Ben Stiller appears as a defendant in a trial, clearly referencing the Menendez brothers, with courtroom broadcasts playing constantly in the background. In 2005, Eric gave his first major interview since the arrest, but a real wave of renewed interest came in the late 2010s during the height of the Me Too movement. The culture was fixated on abuse, power, and cover-ups. Court TV, the channel that first gained fame by airing the Menendez trial, was revived with live coverage of Harvey Weinstein's trial. Suddenly, the Menendez brothers were back in the public conversation. Lyle began speaking to journalists expressing regret but insisting, "We were defending ourselves, we weren't thinking rationally." Documentaries followed, and eventually Lyle was transferred to the same prison as Eric. After 22 years, the brothers were reunited. Then Netflix, TikTok, and younger audiences rediscovered the case. Clips of the brothers as young, emotional men spread online, with campaigns demanding their release. Supporters argued that if the trial happened today, execution wouldn't even be on the table. California hasn't executed anyone in nearly 20 years, and attitudes toward abuse have shifted. Society is more willing to recognize that boys, too, can be victims. A few years ago, a man came forward claiming that in 1984, when he was 14 and part of a teen boy band where Ricky Martin also started, Jose Menendez abused him. At the time, Jose was a top executive at the record company managing them. The brothers' lawyers presented this as new evidence and pushed for either a retrial or a resentencing. Today, Eric is 54, Lyle is 57. Both have served life without parole. The new evidence could at least give them the chance to request parole. Initially, prosecutors showed support, citing public opinion, but a new district attorney reversed course and opposed any review. That sparked outrage from the brothers' relatives, who lead a coalition for their release. Their only outspoken family opponent, an uncle who believed the murders were all about inheritance, died of cancer this year. Now the rest of the family backs them. The brothers have also filed a clemency petition directly with the governor. In February, he tasked experts with assessing whether they still pose a risk. Then came a shock in May. A court softened their sentence, granting them the formal right to seek parole. Before, that option didn't exist. What happens next? They'll apply, the parole board will review, but the governor makes the final call and can veto parole even if it's recommended. That happened in 2002 when the board recommended release for Robert Kennedy's assassin. The Menendez brothers' clemency plea is still on the governor's desk. And then, in late August 2025, came another twist. On August 21st and 22, two separate parole panels of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation reviewed the brothers' cases. Both commissions denied parole, first for Eric, then for Lyle, concluding that they still pose a risk to society because of their character traits, such as dishonesty and repeated rule-breaking during their incarceration. So the debate rages on. Are Lyle and Eric victims of horrific abuse who snapped, or cold-blooded killers who invented excuses? The truth may be both. Relatives' testimony suggests real abuse, yet it's also possible the brothers planned the murders for revenge or financial gain. Maybe they truly believed their father had cut them out of the will. Maybe they didn't know about the insurance. Maybe killing their parents seemed like a way to end the abuse and cash out. Either way, their father shaped them in his own image. Harsh, domineering, cruel. He threatened, and they finished what he started. In the end, this is a story with no real victims left, only monsters. Violence bred more violence. That's the grim takeaway from the Menendez case.